The man who started the mutiny was not the most dangerous man on the ship. That was the first mistake historians make when they look at these cases. They assume the mutiny leader was the strongest, the most violent, the most feared. Someone who could back his challenge to the captain with the physical credibility to make it stick. It was almost never that man. The men who led pirate mutinies were, in the documented cases that have survived in the Admiralty records and trial transcripts and the occasional memoir, almost always the most persuasive man on the ship. Not the strongest, the most persuasive, the one who could sit in the darkness of the hold at night, with the ship moving beneath him and the captain asleep 2 decks above, and talk other men into something they knew could get them killed, because that was the calculus every potential mutineer faced. On a pirate ship, unlike a Royal Navy vessel, unlike a merchant ship, the captain had been elected, the articles had been signed, the system had been agreed to. A man who mutinied against a pirate captain was not rebelling against imposed authority. He was rebelling against a system he had personally chosen to live inside. And that made the punishment for failed mutiny something different in kind from anything a Royal Navy court-martial could produce. Because it wasn't just the captain's justice that came down on the mutineer. It was the crew's. Start with the mechanics of how mutiny actually worked on a pirate ship, or tried to work, because the popular understanding of it is almost entirely wrong. The Hollywood version is a dramatic confrontation on the main deck. The challenger steps forward, announces his grievance, the crew chooses sides, and whoever wins the fight wins the ship. Clean, immediate, resolved in minutes. The reality, reconstructed from the cases where we have detailed records, was slower, quieter, and considerably more frightening. Pirate mutinies almost always began below decks, in the dark, in conversation. Weeks before any visible action. A man with a grievance, against the captain's decision-making, against his share of a recent prize, against a punishment he considered unjust, against the direction of the voyage, would begin talking. Not loudly, not to everyone, to specific men, chosen carefully. Men he had identified as potentially sympathetic. Men who had their own grievances, their own frustrations, their own reasons to listen. This process, the patient, dangerous work of building a conspiracy below decks, is documented in several trial records with unusual precision, because the Admiralty courts were specifically interested in how mutinies began. They ask that question in every relevant trial, and the answers that come back across multiple cases and multiple ships describe the same pattern. Weeks of careful conversation, soundings taken, commitments extracted quietly, a coalition assembled in the dark before anyone above decks knew what was happening below. This is what made early detection so critical for pirate captains, and the good ones, the ones who survived long careers, were extraordinarily good at it. Bartholomew Roberts, whose name appears throughout this series because his operational methods were documented more thoroughly than almost any other Golden Age pirate, maintained what his surviving crew members described in their trial testimony as an intelligence network within his own ship. Not a formal system, nothing written down, but Roberts had, across years of command, developed a practice of cultivating men within the crew who would tell him things. Not informers in the formal sense. That word carried a specific and dangerous meaning aboard a pirate ship, as Script 3 documented in the context of the sweat punishment. More like men who trusted Roberts enough, or feared him enough, or owed him enough to mention when the quality of conversation in the hold had changed. When men stopped talking about women and drink and what they'd do with their share of the next prize, and started talking in lower voices about specific grievances, specific decisions, specific failures of leadership, Roberts would know within days. What he did with that knowledge was more sophisticated than simple preemption. Roberts would not immediately confront the suspected ringleaders. He would instead create conditions that made the conspiracy untenable. A sudden redistribution of watches that separated the men who had been spending their off hours together. A small but visible gesture toward one of the grievances that had been driving the discontent, not capitulating to it, but acknowledging it. a demonstration of confidence so total that the men who had been quietly assembling a coalition began to doubt whether their conspiracy had been as invisible as they'd assumed. The effect, described by multiple crew members in their depositions, was a kind of slow dissolution. The mutiny that never happened. The conspiracy that collapsed not through force, but through the mutineers' growing suspicion that Roberts already knew. That every whispered conversation in the hold had been observed. That the timing of every watch rotation was too convenient. That the captain who seemed relaxed was in fact watching everything. Whether Roberts actually knew, or whether his crew was pattern-matching their own paranoia onto his normal command behavior, is impossible to determine from the historical record. What is clear is that in a career spanning hundreds of captures and years at sea, Roberts never faced a successful mutiny, and that the crews who served under him believed, consistently, that attempting one would be the last thing they ever attempted. The deterrent was not the punishment. It was the belief that he already knew. When deterrence failed, when the conspiracy survived long enough to become action, the moment of the actual mutiny attempt was almost always violent, fast, and decided within minutes. The pattern that appears across documented cases. The conspirators would wait for a specific moment of captain vulnerability, the middle watch, when the fewest men were on deck. A moment of distraction, a sail sighted, a squall developing, any event that pulled the captain's attention, or simply the moment when enough of the conspirators were simultaneously armed and positioned that they judged the odds had shifted in their favor. And then it happened, or it tried to. The reason most pirate mutinies failed is straightforward and brutal. The crew was never as united as the conspirators believed. The men who had nodded in the dark, who had seemed sympathetic, who had said enough to give the ringleaders confidence, in the moment of actual violence, with a choice between the mutiny they had half agreed to in whispers and the captain they had elected and the articles they had signed, a significant portion of them chose the articles, not out of loyalty to the captain necessarily, out of self-interest, because a failed mutiny meant death, and the odds of any given mutiny succeeding were not good, and standing with the captain in the moment of crisis was both safer and legally defensible. I was never part of it. I stood against it when it came to action, in a way that participation was not. This crew fracture, the gap between the men who were genuinely committed and the men who had seemed committed, is documented in almost every failed mutiny case with striking consistency. The ringleaders would make their move and discover, in the worst possible moment, that their coalition was half the size they'd counted on. What followed was swift and total. The case of John Gow is one of the most thoroughly documented pirate mutinies in the historical record, and it illustrates every stage of the pattern with unusual clarity. Gow was not originally a pirate captain. He was a ship's gunner on the merchant vessel Caroline, operating in the Mediterranean in 1724. The Caroline's captain, a man named Fernot, had earned the genuine hatred of his crew through a combination of brutal treatment, withheld wages, and what several crew members later described as deliberate cruelty for its own sake. He was, by the account of the men who served under him, precisely the kind of merchant captain that Script 6 documented as endemic to that system. Gow organized the mutiny over several weeks. He identified his core conspirators, 5 men he was certain of. He identified a larger circle of men he believed would join once the action started. He identified the moment, the night watch, when Fernot and his officers would be below or distracted. On the night of November 3, 1724, Gow and his core conspirators moved. They killed Captain Fernot and 3 officers. They went to the larger circle of men they had counted on, and found that several of them, faced with the reality rather than the whispered plan, refused to participate. Gow proceeded anyway, took command of the ship, and renamed her the Revenge. The mutiny had succeeded. Gow was now a pirate captain. What happened next is the part of the Gow case that historians find most instructive. Because Gow immediately faced, as captain, the same problem Fernot had faced. He had a crew of men, some of whom had committed to him fully, some of whom had been swept along by circumstance, and some of whom were already having second thoughts. He needed to hold them together, and he had no articles, no signed code, no voted-upon system of consequences. He had only fear, Gow's solution was the one that tyrant captains across maritime history had reached for when they had nothing else. He made examples. Men who questioned his decisions were punished immediately and severely, outside any formal process, on his personal authority. Men who seemed to be losing enthusiasm were watched, and several were subjected to punishments that Gow administered not because the articles prescribed them, there were no articles, but because he needed the rest of the crew to understand that wavering had a visible cost. It worked for approximately 8 months. In July 1725, Gow's crew mutinied against him. The men he had controlled through fear turned on him the moment the fear became insufficient. He was taken, bound, delivered to a Royal Navy vessel, transported to London, tried, and hanged at Execution Dock in August 1725. The man who had mutinied his way to captaincy was killed by the mutiny he had made inevitable through his own command methods. The circle was complete, and its logic was remorseless. A captain who controlled his crew through fear alone had created, in every man aboard, a potential mutineer waiting for the moment fear became insufficient. Roberts had understood this. Gow had not. For the mutinies that failed, the conspiracies that were detected, or that collapsed in the moment of action, or that succeeded briefly before being reversed, the punishment that followed was unlike anything else in the pirate punishment record. Not because it was more physically severe than keel-hauling or the sweat, but because of who administered it. In every other pirate punishment, the crew was the audience, the witnesses, the collective body whose observation gave the punishment its psychological weight. In the punishment of failed mutineers, the crew was the instrument. The men who had stood with the captain when the mutiny broke, the majority who had chosen the articles over the conspiracy, were not merely asked to watch. They were required to participate directly in what happened to the men who had tried to overthrow the system they had all agreed to live inside. Every man who had stood for the ship became, in the punishment of the mutineers, an executioner of the compact they shared. The specific forms this took varied by captain and by circumstance. In some documented cases, the ringleaders were killed immediately, in the moment of the failed attempt, by the men who had turned against them, not by the captain's order, but by the crew's spontaneous action. In other cases, the ringleaders were secured and a formal process followed. Charges read, evidence presented, vote taken. Death, in these cases, was not the captain's decision. It was unanimous. The unanimity was the point. A man executed by his captain's order is a martyr to some fraction of the crew. A man executed by the crew's unanimous vote is a lesson to all of them equally. The message was not that the captain was powerful. The message was that the system, the articles, the code, the compact they had all signed, was powerful, and that it would defend itself through the hands of every man who had chosen to live inside it. There is a final category of mutiny in the pirate record that deserves its own examination because it operated differently from everything described so far. The successful mutiny that produced not chaos, but a better captain. This happened. Not often, but it happened. And the cases where it happened reveal something important about what the pirate system was actually designed to do. The articles of most pirate crews included a provision that historians note but rarely examine in detail: the right to remove a captain by vote, not through mutiny, through formal process. A crew that believed their captain had failed them in battle, or had made navigational errors that endangered the ship, or had administered punishment unjustly, could call a vote, and if the vote went against the captain, he was removed, demoted in most cases to an ordinary crew position, his authority dissolved by the same democratic process that had given it to him. This happened to Charles Vane in 1718, as scripts 2 and 6 noted briefly. But the fuller account is worth examining here. Vane encountered a French man-of-war and made the decision not to engage, a judgment call that his crew interpreted as cowardice. They called a vote. The vote removed him. A new captain was elected. Vane was put aboard a small prize vessel with a handful of men who remained loyal to him and left behind. He was not killed. He was not tortured. He was not subjected to any of the punishments documented across this series. He was simply no longer the captain. And that, The bloodless, procedural, utterly final removal of a man's authority by the consent of the men who had granted it was in many ways the most radical punishment in the entire pirate system. Because it had no equivalent in the Royal Navy, where captains were appointed by the Crown and could only be removed by courts-martial that required admiralty involvement. It had no equivalent in the merchant system, where the captain's authority derived from the ship's owners and was legally theirs to grant or revoke, not the crew's. Only in the pirate system could the men being governed remove the person governing them through a formal vote, without bloodshed, as a matter of established procedure. Vane survived his removal. He made his way eventually to a small island in the Bay of Honduras, was found by a passing ship whose captain recognized him, was transported to Jamaica, tried and hanged in 1720. Not for his crimes as a pirate captain, for the general charge of piracy that applied to everything he had done since the day he first signed articles. The system that had removed him had been, in its own violent and democratic way, more just than the one that finally killed him. That paradox sits at the heart of everything this series has been examining across 7 episodes. The pirate punishment system was brutal, genuinely, historically, documentably brutal. The cat-o'-nine tails, the keel-hauling, the marooning, the sweat, the gauntlet, the ducking, the spar, the sweat, all of it real, all of it severe, all of it deliberately designed to produce compliance through fear and pain. And yet, the same system that produced those punishments also produced the vote that removed Charles Vane without bloodshed, the guaranteed share that no captain could legally reduce, the right to be heard before any punishment was administered. The articles that meant the man who flogged you had been voted into the position that gave him the authority to do it, by you, among others, in advance. The men who built that system were not philosophers. They were desperate, violent, largely uneducated men who had been at the bottom of every hierarchy their world had offered them. They built it through empirical trial and catastrophic error, through the wreckage of ships where no system existed and everything went wrong, through the slow accumulation of hard experience about what kept armed men pointed in the same direction across months of open ocean. What they built was imperfect, brutal, and frequently terrible. It was also, in the world they lived in, the closest thing to justice most of them had ever experienced. The mutineers who failed understood this in the end. The punishment that came for them came not from a king or an owner or an officer appointed by distant authority. It came from the men who had elected to live by the same code and who had voted to enforce it. That was the real shock of pirate justice. Not how brutal it was, how chosen. What it really did to sailors who disobeyed is shocking. The man who started the mutiny was not the most dangerous man on the ship. He was the most persuasive. And that distinction, between physical threat and the power to talk men into something they knew could get them killed, is what made mutiny on a pirate ship unlike anything that happened on a Royal Navy vessel or a merchant ship. Because when you mutinied against a pirate captain, you weren't rebelling against authority imposed on you. You were rebelling against a system you had personally chosen to live inside. And the punishment that came for you didn't come from the captain. It came from the crew. In this video, Episode 7 and the series finale, we go inside pirate mutiny. The weeks of whispered conspiracy below decks. The intelligence networks that captains like Bartholomew Roberts built to detect it before it happened. The moment the coalition fractured and men who had nodded in the dark chose the articles over the plan. The case of John Gow, who mutinied his way to captaincy and was then mutinied against himself, and the vote that removed Charles Vane without a drop of blood.